If you can just have a seat right up there.
Sleepy, what kind of quite y'all running there?
They're coming, Judge.
Our next witness will be Dr. Harold Scott. Dr. Scott, would you state your full name for the record, please?
Harold D. Scott, MD.
And Dr. Scott, you can pull that microphone a little closer to you so I don't have to lean now. Harold D. Scott, MD, you said?
Yes, sir.
What is your what did you do for a living first, Dr. Scott?
Well, I'm a physician licensed to practice in the state of Texas, and my specialty is psychiatry.
Are you board certified in psychiatry?
Yes, sir, I am.
And how long have you been a MD physician?
It's been almost 45 years.
45 years?
Yes, sir.
And how did you come to be a physician? What's your educational background?
My pre-medical curriculum was at the University of Houston. My MD degree was achieved at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. Completed 1 year of internship at St. Francis Hospital in Wichita, Kansas. Completed 1 year of psychiatric residency at University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City. Completed 2 more years of psychiatric residency at National Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland. I was chief resident there in 1973.
Let me stop you. National Naval Medical Center?
Yes, sir.
Does that indicate that you were serving in one branch of the armed services?
That's the Navy, yes, sir.
And did you serve, how long did you serve in the armed services?
A little over 4 years active duty, 6 to 8 years inactive.
All right, was that all in the Navy or somewhere else?
2 years was Navy, a little over 2 years was assigned to the Marine Corps.
The Marine Corps?
Yes, sir.
So, what era are we talking about? What time range?
I was at Bethesda 71 to 73, with the Marines 73 till fall of 75, and then reserve years after that.
And did that coincide with our involvement in Vietnam?
Vietnam was winding down at that time, yes, sir. I had 4 years of Vietnam era service.
So as a result of that, did you have a lot of exposure to service members in a psychiatric setting related to Vietnam?
Actually, not directly, Counselor. My role was as director of the psychiatric unit at the Marine Corps Recruit Training Depot, Paris Island. We had 3 psychiatrists, 3 psychologists in our department. We were primarily involved in evaluating and assessing Marine recruits in terms of their potential for honorable service after they had problems.
So people coming into the Marines rather than people coming back from combat?
It was more incoming.
Okay.
I believe I sent home, I believe it was about 10,000 in a little over 2 years, at least under my, over my signature.
Okay.
I didn't see them myself.
So after your service at the Naval, for the Navy and the Marines, what professionally did you do after that?
I left active duty to be the psychiatrist at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I was there for 6.5 years. I returned to my native Texas to be on the staff of Audie Murphy VA Hospital in San Antonio. I was also had a faculty position at the medical school in San Antonio. I was recruited from that position to work with a rural mental health center in Central Texas, and basically did that half-time while I built up private practice. So I did private practice and consulting for about the next 20 years. I lived in Brown County. And
Is that Brownwood or Brownville?
it's Brownwood, and county seat, Brownwood is the county seat of Brown County.
Okay. Continue, you were in private practice for 20 years.
That's correct. And then my son and daughter came off to school here, so my wife and I followed them about 11 years ago. We're in the Austin area, in Georgetown.
Okay, you live up in Sun City, is that right?
That's correct.
Any interaction with the criminal justice system in Texas or the youth justice system?
Yes, while I was in Brownwood, I consulted with Texas Youth Commission for about 18 years.
And what sort of consultations did you do with TYC?
It was basically evaluating kids who had problems to see if they were in need of psychiatric services. Generally, the service that a psychiatrist would provide that others could not would involve basically clarifying a diagnosis and then, if necessary, to prescribe. We certainly didn't want to prescribe if it were not indicated. Putting pills in somebody's mouth is not good unless there's a clear reason for that. So the effort was to try to provide a service, and I feel like we did in many cases.
Okay. And you said that's for TYC. Is that for in-custody facilities, or is that for kids out on probation?
These were all convicted felons, yes, sir. So it was a correctional setting for youthful offenders. Many times the offense was as a juvenile, but of course we had kids back then that really weren't kids, because back then we had them age 17 up to 21, so of course they were legal adults, but they offended as juveniles.
Okay. And how many juveniles do you think you dealt with during that time period?
It would be hard to say. I know the census of the two the centers that I covered, the most we ever had was 535, and I did it for 18 years. So it would get up into the thousands. Those were not all on my caseload, but I was responsible for them.
And so you have familiarity with controlled settings that are not prison, but they're very similar to prison.
Yes, it would be similar in that, in the juvenile setting, yes, sir.
More of a youth prison, you might say.
That's correct.
And so you know about the control features that prisons have, generally speaking. You know about the psychiatric treatment that may be available in a prison setting. Are those things that are somewhat familiar to you?
I'm not that familiar with the adult system. I just have a vague familiarity with it. But I'm certainly intimately familiar with the TYC programs. I also consulted at other centers at Marlin, and when the San Saba program opened, I helped get that started. Was there 6 months.
And so I contacted you to get involved in this case. So you're, just so it's very clear, you're one of the defense experts, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What brought you to wanting to do this forensic psychiatry? Why did that get drawn to that?
Well, I originally provided consultative service when I was in Tennessee. I became involved with, I guess it was the leading criminal defense team in Eastern Tennessee, and did work with them back in the 70s. In Central Texas, it was more providing a service, I hate to say begrudgingly, but it's a service that needed to be provided. I didn't mind sitting in court all day, but my private practice patients didn't. They weren't very tolerant of that. So, but it was a service that had to be provided. Primarily, the vast majority of my cases were competency to stand trial and insanity cases.
Okay. So you do competency and insanity evaluations for the court for one part of the is that right?
Yes, sir. I'm certified by the state as a forensic examiner in that capacity.
And have you worked for both sides of the criminal justice system, both the defense and for the state?
Yes, sir.
And does either side purchase an opinion, or is your opinion what you see when you review the records?
Well, I just try to determine what the truth of the matter is as I can determine it.
Okay.
That can obviously be much more conflictual when I'm consulting in cases that where the issues go beyond simple competency and sanity, but those issues can obviously be fairly conflictual too.
Have you worked on capital murder cases before?
Yes, I have. This is my third testimony this month in murder cases. 2 of them are capital.
Okay. Well, let's talk about capital murders in which the death penalty was sought. Have you assisted either or both sides in those types of cases?
Yes, I have.
And explain to the jury.
Well, I've assisted the prosecution in seeking a death penalty verdict, and was successful in doing that.
And so you don't have some moral compunction against the death penalty that keeps you from working for that side if you think that's appropriate, is that correct?
I don't have a rigid standard. I have my preferences, but I felt like it was my duty to serve, and I did it, and I do the same thing. Sadly, the person was executed.
And that's part of the system. That was the outcome in that
Right.
particular case.
I've also refused defense requests before
Right.
when asked.
What was your basis for refusing the defense request for assistance?
I didn't want to be involved. I wasn't convinced that the truth of the matter called for my interfering.
Okay. In this particular case, when I contacted you to, if you would be willing to help out on this case, did you immediately leap to it and say yes?
No, sir.
What process did you have to go through to decide whether you were interested in getting involved?
Well, the terms that you accepted would be that I would see your client at jail, and my standard would be I would try to determine if he had potential for redemption. And if I believe that he did, then I would proceed. Otherwise, there'd be no fee, and everybody would just proceed accordingly.
And so, since then, after that, you agreed to work with us on this case?
That's correct.
And despite that, is it still what you're saying, that you're here to tell the truth as you see it?
That's correct.
What I'd like to do before we talk about the psychiatric diagnosis necessarily is talk about these medical records I placed in front of you and an incident in which Brandon Daniel I believe the records will show attempted to commit suicide while in jail. Are you familiar with that incident?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Are you familiar with
Yes,
that
sir, I
incident?
am. Yes, sir, I am.
I'm sorry, you have a slight hearing deficit. I tend to trail off at the end, so let me know.
I really have more than a slight hearing deficit, and I tend to take care of it as soon as I get some time.
Fair enough. So you've reviewed the medical records for the Brackenridge Hospital?
Yes, sir, there were over 400 pages. I studied them very closely. I don't remember everything that's in them, but at the time I studied them very closely.
And you made some notes that you have in front of you about your observations from those medical records.
Yes, sir, I did.
And so what I'd like to do is for you to walk us through what you did to determine whether that was a true suicide attempt or whether he was malingering in some way. So what's the first step you took to determine one way or the other?
Well, my recollection, Counselor, is that I reviewed them more or less in chronological order. I tried to study what the emergency room physician encountered at that time, tried to see how well they substantiated their findings, what it is they observed, and then what they did about it.
Okay. So we have a big, huge stack of medical records there in front of us. It's totally foreign to most of us to look at these medical records. What's the purpose of doctors and nurses keeping those medical records?
Well, obviously one purpose would be in case situations arise like this. But the ultimate objective is patient care. And there have to be good records to show that you have clarity of thought. Doctors are not on board 24 hours all the time, so there has to be a clear documentation for the next shift. It just serves patient care.
Okay. So Dr. A wants to document his observations so that Dr. B, who comes on later, will know what Dr. A did and saw and learned. Is that correct?
That's correct. There needs to be some continuity.
All right. And so were you able to piece together these records to show a fairly clear picture of what it is that happened that day?
In my opinion, it's a very clear opinion. Now, that's not my field. I'm a psychiatrist, so I don't get involved in, I make my share of referrals probably, but I don't get involved in actual treatment of toxic cases. But as a licensed physician, anyone licensed would be, I think, fully qualified to read the record and make basic understanding and interpretation of what it says.
And the record, really, when you read it, is very clear for you. Is that not correct?
Any record can be somewhat complicated, almost contradictory, but that's just because they're doing the best they can as things unfold. So anyone familiar with records and the doctor's handwriting, we anticipate that. So, but once you put it all together and really cross-check and look at timelines, this is a fairly compelling narrative.
Okay. Well, let's walk through the narrative then, because you created basically sort of a bullet point timeline for us. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the earliest entry there in your timeline that you were?
Well, I noticed that it said upon arrival, it said, quote, awake and alert on arrival, end quote. He apparently...
I'm sorry, can you move back just a tiny bit from the microphone? It's just distorting just a little bit.
Back, I'm sorry.
That's better.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so when he first arrived, what was the notation?
Apparently it said awake and alert on arrival.
What does that mean?
Well, just what it says. He seemed fine. I seem to recall reading records where he was conversational. He was talking about the awarenesses that he had. He had a physical awareness of, I forgot if it was anxiousness or uneasiness. I can put my diagnosis to it later, but that's kind of getting ahead of it. But
now, does that awake and alert on arrival then change it somewhat?
yes, it does.
And what change does it make from the records?
Okay, from the record, the doctor noticed, quote, progressive decrease in level of consciousness and increasing tachycardia. So his heart rate increased, his level of consciousness decreased. Level of consciousness,
What are we talking about?
consciousness has to do with alertness, awareness of one's surroundings. I'm not sure what they specifically ask him. Name, date, just orientation, just basic, what time of day is it day or night, just common sense things like that.
Okay. Well, if a person was faking They might get nervous about faking and their heart rate might increase. Is that what tachycardia means?
Well, it could be. Someone who's faking is going to start off faking. They're not going to start off fine and then get to a state where they're unresponsive. So that just doesn't, that's just not logical.
I understand what you're saying, that if a person was faking a suicide attempt, they would fake unresponsiveness, they would do this other stuff up front rather than later. Is that what you're trying to say?
Right. And tachycardia, you're not going to be able to fake, you know, that's, I don't know what his resting was, that's 3 times my resting, so you're not going to be able to fake that, or you're just anxiousness is not going to do that.
Okay, you said when you were talking about resting, explain to the jury what you're talking about.
Well, just his presumptive pulse rate before the incident.
Okay, so what's a normal range for a pulse rate?
60 to 90,
If a person is just sitting in a chair or laying on a bed, 60 to 90?
something like that. There's a lot of inter-individual variation.
Okay.
When I've been in shape, mine's been as low as 39. Right now, it's probably considerably higher.
Okay. So what happens then? So we start off with awake and alert. There's a change to progressive decrease. What happens next?
Well, there was a quote, after several hours in the emergency room, appeared unresponsive, some spastic activity of the extremities intermittently, no response to commands, hyperreflexia.
Okay, let's go through that piece by piece. So several hours later, so this is not something that happens immediately, right?
No, he was apparently in the emergency suite for several hours being observed.
Not just in the hospital, but in the emergency
He's
suite.
still in the emergency suite at this point.
Appeared unresponsive. That's again something a person could fake, appearing to be unresponsive, correct?
Well, the wording that says appeared, if you take that literally, that doesn't tell me that they're necessarily trying to stimulate him with pain or other sensations. So I would guess that they were calling his name and trying to arouse him, and he didn't respond.
Okay.
So that's what that would be my interpretation of that word.
So combined with some spastic activity of the extremities intermittently, what does that mean?
The spastic activity, now you're not going to be able to fake that. That's like stiffness. We speak of the term spastic. It just basically means stiff activity of the muscle.
Okay. And no response to command, so apparently they're trying to wake him up. He's not responding. Is that right?
That's correct.
Hyperreflexia, what does that mean?
Hyperreflexia is just basically brief reflexes, knee jerk, tendon, just different reflexes that they'll check.
Does that go along with the spastic activity?
Yes, it does.
Are either of those a sign of what possibly could have been taken as far as an overdose drug?
Well, with 20/20 hindsight, it's much clearer. Those would be clues, but they're not definitive enough to point a doctor in the right direction and say, oh, this is obviously what we've got here.
So it's not an obvious red flag yet?
No, I mean, it might suggest that, okay, it's not something that, like a narcotic, that's going to make him just unresponsive. It's something that's having an effect on the motor system, the muscle system, whether it's a peripheral effect or a central effect.
Okay.
We subsequently learned it's more of a central effect in this case.
Increase in heart rate?
Yes, 170 to 175 is pretty striking.
And is that higher than, or is that the kind of heart rate a person would have if they're racing a race, or is it higher than that, or what kind of heart rate is that?
Well, if the normal is 60 to 90.
And so this is an extremely high heart rate.
Yes, it is.
And what's the danger of having such a high heart rate?
Well, it varies. If you have a healthy young individual, it might be okay. And in fact, athletes push themselves up to the maximum like that. I wouldn't want to go that high. I guess I've done it in my day, but it's just, you can get a cardiac crisis.
Is it possible to fake a heart rate like that?
I think any doctor has learned, if they're ever asked a question, is it possible, the answer is always yes. But it's virtually, it's improbable. There would be ways of hiding a stimulant or jacking your pulse up. I wouldn't want to make a conclusion based solely on heart rate.
But there'd have to be some kind of stimulant, you're saying?
Well, a stimulant could do it.
Okay. Well, what about the EKG? What's the EKG?
Okay, the significance of the EKG, it showed evidence of toxicity. The QTC interval, and again, I'm not an expert on EKGs anymore, but that's a segment of the electrocardiogram. It said it was mildly elevated on arrival, so his baseline, his variation of normal could be that it was mildly elevated, and that has no clinical significance. But now well over 500 milliseconds, that would have a definite significance to an emergency room physician.
Okay. So
It shows something's wrong.
That's another sign there's something wrong. A sign that somebody's not faking something. There's something wrong with this person.
That's a real sign, yes, sir.
Okay. What's the physician's assessment then as the next chronological entry?
This emergency room physician, I didn't write down the name, quote, "The patient is critically ill. He is getting worse from absorption of the drugs he took. He is at risk for respiratory failure with his increasing decrease in level of consciousness."
Okay, so is the physician just writing that to cover himself, or is that's his observation to pass on to the next physician?
That would be the doctor's impression.
Okay. So what's their response then? Can you tell?
What they did was they, certainly initiated treatment, IV fluids, electrolytes. I know he was admitted to intensive care unit because it said condition, quote, worsened. In other words, he was worse than he was in the emergency room.
So even though we've heard that he's critically ill, getting worse, he worsened after that and they put him in the ICU?
I wouldn't know what they're comparing that with, counselor. It could be that he was worse than on arrival, maybe worse than when he left ER. I'm not sure.
Certainly much worse than being awake and alert.
He certainly had deteriorated.
Okay. And eventually they give him an endotracheal tube. Is that correct?
He had to have intubation, and he had to. He was subjected to a respirator, so they ventilated him.
Explain to the jury what we're talking. What does that mean? How does that work? And
It means he had respiratory failure, respiratory arrest, and he wasn't breathing. And if he didn't breathe, he wouldn't survive.
And do they do that just because they think this person might be in some distress, or do they do that because the person is just not breathing?
They do it when the person is in distress. In this case, my guess is that he was probably had more and more shallow breathing, maybe slower breathing. It's not like an acute incident, but he just appeared to be going down. I should also mention part of their treatment was obviously to do a drug screen. I don't think I mentioned that. That's not generally thought of a treatment, but that is part of the protocol.
Okay. What about the endotracheal? What is that? Where does it go?
It goes nasal, tracheal, down into the trachea, into the, trachea lead into the bronchi and into the lungs.
Is that a comfortable procedure or not?
It's not comfortable, but it wouldn't be uncomfortable for him because he wouldn't be perceiving any painful sensations.
So you're saying he's unconscious. That's why it's not uncomfortable.
Essentially, yes. He was unresponsive. He was unconscious.
What does that say about whether he's malingering these symptoms?
Well, people can fake unresponsiveness, but they're not going to be able to sit there and subject themselves to intubation.
Because that's a very painful and uncomfortable situation.
It's uncomfortable,
It's
right.
uncomfortable to put in, it's uncomfortable to leave it in. Is that correct?
I suspect both.
You said there was a drug screen. Why would they do a drug screen? It seems obvious. Why would they do a drug screen?
I believe that was the history. I'd have to look back to be clear, but I think it was suspected. I believe he told them. I don't remember, but I believe he told them that he had taken some pills.
So if he had told the jailers, I took some pills, that's the reason why the jailers took him to the hospital.
Right.
It only stands to reason the hospital's going to do a drug screen.
Right. And I don't know that they did it immediately, but they would do it. They would do it for their record. I mean, probably even if he looked okay, they're going to have to do it for their record. But having been in that position, they're going to be prejudiced. He's an inmate, He looks fine to them. If I'm in that situation, I'm going to be very cynical that we've got somebody here taking up my time.
Sure, just trying to fake it.
Right, sure, for whatever motive.
Fair enough. There's some kind of a psychiatric consultation as well, is there not?
Eventually.
Okay.
Now, I suspect usually psychiatric consultations come much later after someone is cleared medically.
Okay.
I won't say all his issues had resolved or he might have been released, but the psychiatric consultation was probably felt to be warranted prior to release.
Okay.
I don't
And-
remember the timing.
And do you remember what the consultation, what the results of that were?
There was a confirmation of major depression, a recommendation for antidepressant medication. I believe they actually did initiate an antidepressant called Celexa.
Okay. And then what is their actual diagnosis that the doctor says this is the diagnosis we're doing?
The final diagnoses, is that what you're asking?
Final diagnosis.
I'm reading from what I wrote down from the record: poisoning by other specified drug, acute respiratory failure, nonspecific abnormal EKG, tachycardia unspecified, depressive disorder not otherwise specified.
Okay. So let's start with the very beginning, diagnosis. Now, first of all, I guess diagnosis, who writes the diagnosis? The doctor or a nurse? Who does that?
Well, the doctor originates it. It depends. So many times now you have, like in state hospitals, a psychiatric staff person might do it, but in this case it was clearly by the physician.
Okay. So the physician says diagnosis 1, poisoning by other specified drugs.
That's correct.
What does that mean to you when you know about the drug screening that they did?
In terms of the drug screen?
Yes.
Well, the drug screen, you have to contextualize that, Counselor. They're doing the best job they can. They have a certain protocol. They have tests that they, or agents that they look for, but there are thousands of medicinal and non-medicinal agents that can cause symptoms when someone comes in an emergency room. They're going to check for the most common ones: aspirin, Tylenol, acetaminophen.
Let me stop you for a second. Can you put your hands on the actual drug screen from the medical?
Yes, I can.
Your arm apples. And Dr. Scott, I'm going to put this on the overhead projector. Will you be able to see the screen over here if we put this on behind you? Okay, so you said generally they test for, what kinds of things do they usually test for?
They're going to test for the most commonly abused items: aspirin, Tylenol, alcohol, all the common drugs of abuse, barbiturates, narcotics, cannabis, hallucinogens.
Because they don't know what they're looking for, right? Okay.
And it's interesting, they also check for part of their protocol to do a tricyclic level. Tricyclics are old antidepressants. They're hardly ever prescribed anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But my guess is the importance in including that, I'm not on their committees and so forth, but my guess is that the lethality or the tendency to cause death of these old antidepressants is considerable. So if someone has an antidepressant that they've overdosed on, they certainly want to know that.
Okay, well, let's go look at the screen here, doctor. If you'll step on down and come on over here. So this is actually the drug screen itself that was done at the hospital, is that correct?
That appears to be.
And it's contained in the medical records, you pulled it right out of their records, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so what things, this is terribly badly focused, can you focus it any better? Where's the bad copy? What things up here did they test for first? Can you even read that? Oh, I can't see it. Okay, up at the top, what did these things?
It starts off with acetaminophen, which would be Tylenol, ethanol, which is alcohol, salicylate, which is aspirin, tricyclic is the old first-generation antidepressants.
Okay, so the first two, the first one and the third one, those are Tylenol and aspirin, is that correct?
Yes.
So we know that Mr. Daniel didn't take Tylenol, didn't overdose with Tylenol and aspirin.
Right, he's got a little zero.
The middle one, oh, that's much better, Brett, thank you. The middle one is ethanol, that's alcohol, right? And we know he hasn't done an overdose of alcohol.
No.
Because that's what the test says. The third one is tricyclic, and is that the old style antidepressant?
Yes, sir.
And now, explain for the jury again why it is they would even bother to test for an old style antidepressant.
Because the lethality is so considerable. It's the likelihood that it can cause death. Those old medications, that's one of the problems. We don't prescribe them unless someone's depressed. It's the depressive patient who's vulnerable to suicide. So it's a very risky situation, especially now with newer antidepressants. If we prescribe one of these older ones, we really better have good documentation as to why we're doing that, because they really can be very lethal.
Okay, but we're aware they're not prescribing these old style antidepressants in our county jail, are they?
As a matter of policy, they wouldn't. On an exceptional basis, I wouldn't say they don't prescribe at all,
Okay.
because it could be an exceptional case.
But we know that in this case, there's no blood level for the old style.
It says negative.
Okay. So those are is that blood test at the top and urine test at the bottom?
Apparently so, yes.
Does this middle part mean anything to you?
This acetaminophen is up here, this is alcohol, this is salicylate.
Okay.
And they're given some levels to help the doctor decipher the numbers that come back.
Okay.
And the numbers are 0.
Right. So really that doesn't mean an awful lot to us. But those are the only things that were tested for in his blood, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Aspirin, Tylenol, alcohol, and the old style tricyclic antidepressants.
According to this, yes.
Okay. Urine toxicology. What was tested for in the urine?
Well, the first would be amphetamine, barbiturates, benzodiazepine like Valium, Flanac, so forth, cannabis, cocaine, opiates, narcotics, hydrocodone, and so forth. And cyclidine, of course, is PCP, which is a hallucinogen.
Okay. And that's all they tested for?
Amongst those commonly abused agents, yes, it's my understanding.
Those are agents of common abuse. Those are the kinds of things they might look for.
Yes, sir.
They did look for in this particular case.
Yes,
And that's why they look for them, because those are common agents of abuse. Is that right?
that's my understanding.
Okay. So amphetamine, no amphetamine in the system. No barbiturates or barbiturates. That's the old style hypnotic tranquilizer, is that right?
Right.
No benzodiazepines, no marijuana,
None.
no cocaine or heroin, opium,
Right.
and no phencyclidine. What's that?
That's correct.
What is that? Phencyclidine.
PCP, angel dust, sometimes it's fly,
Okay.
or embalming fluid is mixed with that.
Excellent. Can you just have CD, please? Okay, so it is a true comment to say his drug screen came back negative. That's true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because for all those things that they tested for, he's negative.
Absolutely.
Does that mean he didn't do a drug overdose?
Absolutely not. It means that the drug test did not confirm anything.
Right. So did you take some steps? I appreciate that. So did you take some steps to determine, based on what he told the police, what he might have taken?
Did I take some steps?
Yes.
Well, I was curious. I wanted to know the best I could,
Okay.
and I did take a few steps. The history I had was that it was a psych drug. I'm suspecting haloperidol. That's a generic form of Haldol, which is the most common psych drug in an institutional setting.
Okay.
It's actually an antipsychotic. It's a first generation, so it's an old antipsychotic. It's available as a generic. It's cheap. I see it all over the state. It's not necessarily the best drug, but it can serve a purpose. So I suspected that.
What was the physics? You suspected that to begin with, is that right?
I wouldn't say, well, I kind of knew the history. I kind of put it all together almost spontaneously. I mean, integrated it together.
Okay.
I'm not fast. It wasn't spontaneous, but it all came to me roughly about the same time. It fell together.
So we got the idea that maybe it's haloperidol or Haldol, because it's a psych pill. What about the color? Does that make any difference?
Well, I checked with the pharmacist because I was suspecting generic haloperidol.
What pharmacist?
The pharmacist with the Del Valley jail.
Okay.
And confirmed that, yes, their 10 milligram generic Haldol is a green tablet.
Okay. And what about, we know a person has access to that in Del Valley to begin with.
That's correct.
Okay. What about his symptoms when he was at the hospital? Are those consistent with overdosing on Haldol?
That would be very compatible and very suggestive of Haldol or a drug in the Haldol class.
Okay.
Because the diagnosis that we now know is akathisia, a fancy word for ants in your pants. You just can't sit still. He was very restless. It's an uncomfortable feeling. It looks like anxiety to the observer. It gets misdiagnosed all the time. I've had it diagnosed as mania. Patients that the family want me to admit their loved one to the family when it's an akathisia. It's not mania. Medicines like Reglan can cause an akathisia. So he had that. When you've seen it enough, you kind of learn to recognize it, and that's one advantage of being old, I guess.
We went back, earlier when we talked about how he had this spastic activity in the extremities, I forget what, hyperreflexia. Are those the kinds of things that you're talking about?
Right. The akathisia could very likely evolve to a more significant central nervous system effect. It's a part of the brain called the nigrostriatal pathways that dopamine is blocked, and that's what creates a lot of these symptoms.
What pathway is that again?
It's not important.
Well,
Nigrostriatal.
we're going to have to take it down. So what? Say it one more time slow.
It's just one of the pathways in the brain.
Okay.
But
Unspecified.
spasticity and hyperreflexia would be a natural evolution of this.
So if it was this green pill, which was Haldol, that would be, the symptoms that were noted would be consistent with taking an overdose of Haldol.
That's correct.
Physical symptoms.
And there was another bit of confirmation, if I can elaborate. When I saw from the EMR, the electronic medical record at the jail, that he had complaints. It was referred to as a dystonia. A dystonia is a spasm, but it's kind of a, we use that term, it kind of points the finger at something like Haldol because it's a drug-induced problem. If one suspects that, there's a treatment, and the treatment is to give cogentin. It can be given, orally or intramuscularly. And if one gives that treatment and the patient clears up, then that's further, that goes in the column that apparently was the offending agent.
So
And he did get cogentin and he did get better.
So they gave him cogentin at jail?
That's my understanding that he didn't get it at the hospital. It was given, yes, it was at the jail. Yes, I did read that.
So we have physical symptoms that are consistent with an overdose of Haldol. We have
Correct.
Treatment at the jail that's consistent with treating a person who had overdosed on Haldol.
That's correct.
And we have a blood screen which didn't screen for Haldol. Is that
That's correct.
And why would they not have screened for Haldol?
Well, that's a good question. I suspect that if they started seeing many cases and that this would be a way they could serve the public, they would maybe make some changes in their procedures.
Is Haldol something that is a common drug for suicide attempters?
Not really, and it's not generally as lethal as some could be. But it certainly, has been used. I'm not that familiar with its lethality, frankly.
So would you say...
I haven't used it in 20 years.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I haven't used it. I use the newer medications.
Fair enough. But the jails, to some extent, want to go with the lowest cost option, and the oldest medicines are oftentimes the lowest cost.
There's actually some support for that. If you're looking at some of the psychoses and schizophrenias, there are some studies that say the older, cheaper medicine is just as good. That's not true if you have syndromes that are complicated by mood disorders. The newer medications are much better. And they have fewer side effects and really less medical legal liability for those side effects.
Okay. So based on your review of the documents and talking to the folks at the jail, looking at the records from the jail, can you say to any degree of medical scientific certainty whether this was an actual drug overdose or whether it was a fake drug overdose?
Well, I can say with pretty firm medical certainty it was a legitimate overdose. I can state with reasonable medical certainty the offending agent was haloperidol.
Haldol.
Haloperidol is a generic for Haldol. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to make sure that we're clear on it. Okay, thank you for clearing that up for us. Well, I guess let's perfectly quick. Is there anything other than a vanishing chance that this was? Is there any chance at all, really, that this is malingering? This is just fake?
Any chance of malingering? No, sir. There would be no chance. I really believe. I mean, as often as doctors like to disagree, I really think if you brought in 1,000, they'd agree on this. I did see one use of that word in the emergency room. I think it was probably the initial physician put something like, I don't remember the full clause, but it said ingestion, diagnosis, quote, ingestion / malingering, open parentheses, doubt. And from knowing doctors, I suspect very strongly that malingering was put in to kind of cover him or her just in case it came back that way.
Sure.
So it's an attempt to be thorough, and again, I think it reflects a prejudice of having an inmate there who looked fine and is claiming these things, and that's unfortunate, but if I were in their situation, I would be cynical and prejudiced also.
Well, you'd want to be skeptical, because you have this person in jail, maybe he's just here for a lark, and maybe he's malingering. You should check that out if you have an inmate.
So he was showing the record that he was at least considering malingering, which I think is thorough. I would applaud that. And as things evolved, it would be clear to all the clinicians that malingering, it ruled itself out.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so thank you for clearing that question. So do you still have an active, we're going to move on to the really primary thing that we're here. Do you still have an active psychiatric practice?
I'm sorry?
Do you still have a fully active psychiatric practice, or have you changed your, are you semi-retired?
I like to think I'm semi-retired, but I haven't been sleeping very much lately. So I do consult with a school-based grant in East Williamson County, and so I get to see kids in that capacity. It's not that demanding. I see kids from Thrall and Copeland and Taylor and Granger and Bartlett. It's really only about every third week. And other than that, I provide services to the courts, primarily district courts, some county courts, some federal, but mostly district courts.
And you do some competency in psychiatric or sanity evaluation?
It's almost exclusively that. This obviously was not. I get some requests in the forensic arena that are different.
Okay.
But statistically, the vast majority are competency and our sanity.
All right. So what interviews did you do, and what records did you review in order to prepare to testify?
Okay, I have interviewed Brandon on 5 different occasions, a little over 10 hours total. I reviewed all the available records that I had. It would be the investigative reports. I believe that's over 600 pages, over 400 pages from Breckenridge Hospital, probably a couple hundred pages of EMR, electronic medical records from Del Valley. Excuse me. Everything that was provided. I looked at some videos that were hard to look at, but I needed to. And transcripts of grand jury, the transcribed conversations, school records, disciplinary records, college records, everything that I had available, I looked at. Only recently did I get to look at some of the material, the concussive injury material. And in fact, that was this morning. I knew of it, I just hadn't seen it.
Sure. That's when he was a teenager and had the major concussive event.
That's correct.
Were you able to hear what I said? I'm sorry.
Could you get a little closer to your mic, please?
Yes.
Or,
So that was when he was a teenager and had that major concussive event.
yes, sir. That was, I believe, was just one incident, 15 and a half. Yes, sir.
Fair enough. And after reviewing all that, did you arrive at some sort of diagnosis of Brandon?
Yes, I did.
And what was that diagnosis?
That he's had major depression, severe, recurrent, possibly since childhood, but at least he has suffered at least through adolescence.
Okay. And did you also interview some of his family members?
Yes, I did.
Primarily mother and father. Were you able to talk to mother and father?
I spoke with Brandon's father, but he terminated the interview after about, I don't think we made 15 minutes. Did not speak with Brandon's sister, did not speak with Brandon's mother. I made myself available, I made requests. That's puzzling to me as to why we didn't get together, but I did meet with the father. He's just very ill.
What kind of illness does the father have, if you're aware?
He told me that he had an inherited form of hepatitis. I believe he said there had been a fatality in his family from that disorder. I don't doubt that. My guess is that he may be in hepatic failure, liver failure. And again, being prejudiced, I wonder about cirrhosis. Cirrhosis can certainly evolve from hepatitis. It can evolve from other causes like alcoholism, and I'm certainly suspecting that.
Okay. But you didn't have very much time to visit with Mr. Daniels?
No, I did not. He left. Like I said, he's very ill. He's had fluid drawn off his abdomen, off his chest. He's very ill. But I needed to do my duty, and so I wasn't confrontational, but I did persist. He left, went to the men's room. I thought he was going to be sick. He kind of regained his composure. Went over to the elevators. I went with him. We went down to the lobby. And at that point, I just felt like I needed to disengage. It was inhumane to push it any further.
Okay. And you're just trying to do your due diligence and follow up and get as much information as possible.
I tried in that case.
Something a person might have concern about in this case is the role of skepticism in a psychiatric diagnosis. Is it important for you to be skeptical of the information that you get?
Well, I guess, especially in the forensic arena, one is going to be more cynical and want more corroboration. So I guess there were certain things I was looking for, but I can't say I had the confirmation necessarily. If I were challenged, like did I really prove anything? The findings were certainly not incompatible with what I was suspecting, which was depressive problems and very likely addictive problems.
Fair enough. And where do we get that addictive nature from? Is that something that we're born with? Or
Well, you know, that just with everything, Counselor, we can get into that nature-nurture debate. I'll put it this way. I believe that Brandon is heavily addicted, and I look for a genetic predisposition. I look to see if there's any addiction anywhere.
And with respect to the father, is there any sign that that may be the case?
Well, okay, Brandon characterized his father as having, well, he did it this way. He said his mother used, but not addictively. He characterized his father as having more of an addictive problem, but nobody having the addictive problem that Brandon did, because he characterized himself as out of control. Mm-hmm. So if we compare them like that, that may be a fair description. My feel and guess in terms of what is truthful about the dad is that he has had depression, very likely with addiction masking the depression.
And how does that work?
Well, if you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, the depression, if it's there, is not going to be as recognizable.
Okay. To yourself or to others?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry?
Recognizable to yourself or to others?
Well, to any observer.
Did you talk to Dad about whether he had any substance abuse issues and whether Brendan did?
Yes, sir. I asked about if he had any addictive problem himself, and he said no. I'm cynical. I don't accept that. I can't disprove it, but I'm cynical. There's an interesting element that compounds this. He didn't have, even as fragile and frail as he is, he appears to not have much memory function. I don't know if that's from hepatic failure. It could be embellished. I don't know that it's not. But I asked basic questions, and he didn't have answers. I asked what was Brandon's age when he and Brandon's mother were divorced. He didn't remember. And I said, so you had trouble with memory? He said, I had trouble with everything. I think that's truthful. He's a very intelligent man. I think he loves Brandon. He couldn't give me answers.
Do you think that it's partially the result then of this liver problem that you have, perhaps?
I would have to suspect that plays a big role, Counselor. It's hard to quantify that.
Does he seem like an uncaring father or someone who does care for him?
He's caring. He's definitely caring. He loves Brandon. He left Colorado to come down here to be closer to Brandon and to try to be supportive.
Okay.
He's caring. It's just unfortunate.
Did you talk to him about why it is that Brandon was never taken to a psychiatrist or psychologist as a child?
Yes, sir, and I'm trying to think back. That could have been the point where the interview got stopped. Because my question could have been judgmental. Like, if he's having this trouble with suicide, he's having trouble with drugs, why didn't he get to go? Why wasn't he taken to a psychologist? I suspect I was not as empathic as I could have been.
Okay. And did he have a peculiar response to that question?
Yes, sir, he did. His response was, "Do you trust the government?"
His response to why didn't you take him to the psychiatrist is
Why was he not taken to a psychologist? He said, "Do you trust the government?"
And what does that mean?
Well, it means to me, whether I trust the government or not is a non sequitur, totally irrelevant. It's not even necessarily relevant whether he trusts the government or not. What's relevant to me is what was his thinking process back when Brandon was in his formative years. That's what I'm trying to piece together to understand the truth about Brandon to help the jury with the questions that they struggle with.
Does it indicate to you that he had some peculiar distrust of the government or something?
That would certainly seem that way. We weren't discussing the government. Something's wrong. Now, I don't know if that's an acute problem. I don't know the origin of that. So we can just speculate.
Fair enough. Well, let's move to Brandon's mother. Did you make some attempts to get a hold of and visit with Brandon's mother?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Were you ever able to get a hold of Brandon's mother and interview her?
I was not.
What kind of attempts did you make?
Well, the first place, people know where I am. They know I'm part of the team. I'm trying to help you and co-counsel out. And I've called and no reply.
Okay. Have you sent any text messages?
Text messages were sent to the sister. We exchanged some texts, but haven't had a response from Mom.
Okay. Just totally radio silence from her. Is that right?
Silence is not a word I would use to describe Brandon's mother, but I understand what you're saying. Right.
So, but what do you mean when you say that?
Well, this goes back to Brandon's characterization. Brandon has characterized his dad, and I think somewhat accurately. Dad is self-blaming. Mom, and he's quiet and a loner. Mom tends to go.
What do you mean by
Well, he blames himself.
For what?
He told me that, I don't know if he believes this, but he said, I'm 100% responsible. He said, I'm the one who should be executed. I assured him I would execute him in court, figuratively, if it would save Brandon's life.
What about Brandon's mother?
She's characterized to me as the opposite, not a loner, not quiet. Brandon said she's, he characterized her as a mastermind. I don't remember the other descriptives.
Okay. What observations did you make about her parenting style for when Brandon was growing up? Emotionally available, emotionally unavailable? Where to start?
Well, I guess I'm extrapolating from this situation that she's not available here. And my thought would be that that might parallel emotional unavailability in his childhood. Now, that's speculative. But something was wrong. In terms of discipline, there were problems. In terms of her reported non-response to finding empty cough syrup bottles, finding him trying to kill himself with carbon monoxide poisoning. You asked about discipline. Brandon said that she would overreact to minor transgressions and underreact to major ones. He didn't know what to expect.
I'm sorry, what does that teach a child when the parent overreacts to minor things but ignores major things?
Well, there's just an inability to generalize about what the world is, what the world expects. That kind of inconsistency and unpredictability is just, it's unsettling. It doesn't confirm a kid's perceptions, and it doesn't validate anything. It just generates more turmoil.
Fair. Is there any drug use around mother, or by mother, around the
Brandon said that she did use drugs. I got the impression it was primarily smoking marijuana. There was some very infrequent use of cocaine, I believe. She would ask him to bring some for her. I didn't get the impression that that was addictive. It was more or less maybe something recreational, but maybe she wanted to get a lot done. I know he mentioned that characterization at one point.
But he didn't characterize her as being an alcoholic.
He didn't characterize her as addicted. He thought Dad's problem was worse, and yet his own problem was worse than that. He did say that he thought that she was depressed. In fact, he thought everyone in the family was depressed. He mentioned that his mother had told him that she had overdosed before, mixed with vodka, I believe.
So pills and vodka?
Yes, sir.
As an attempt to commit suicide?
Yes, sir.
And she told her something?
Apparently so. He relayed that. Apparently she survived it and then didn't proceed to get any treatment. They never get treatment. They don't trust doctors. That's the template or the model that they set up for Brandon.
Okay.
Don't get help.
What about, which is one suicide attempt by mother? Is there some other discussion of another suicide attempt or suicide plan developing by mother? Do you recall? During a divorce, the mother goes and purchases a gun?
Well, I'm not aware of anything in the depressive or suicidal context, counselor. I believe Brandon told me he was about 18 when she purchased a gun, so that would have been after the divorce. The gun, I believe, was for self-protection, but it was pretty well established from their conversation that the gun had this other usefulness for eventual suicide, if she chose to proceed that way.
That seems like a totally bizarre conversation to have with your child.
Well, if he, in fact, was 18, he's not really a child.
Well, he's the offspring of this person. Why would a person, what does that say about a person that they would tell others?
Counselor, any behavior is multi-determined, and I wouldn't want to be judgmental or try to understand that without more information. It's peculiar, but, for all I know, they're both smoking weed at the time. I don't know.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier that Brandon characterized his mother as being the mastermind and controlling, perhaps paranoid. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you did remind me. He said she can be nuts at times. He did say that. That's a quote.
Okay.
And paranoid. He described her as mastermind, and I think there was one email that demonstrates that pretty well.
Can you talk about that email?
I have it. I can read it.
Okay, why don't you do that? And this is an email that I forwarded to you that was sent to the defense team. Is that correct?
That's correct. You
Okay.
forwarded it.
Who sent this from the email header? You can tell who sent this email.
Yeah, to contextualize this is from Brandon's mother to Lisa. Lisa is a member of your professional team. She generally serves in the capacity of compiling mitigative material. So in that capacity, she needs to approach family, extended family. Really, she's looking for anything that might be relevant, that might be pertinent to this punishment phase. So
Can we approach report. Has the mother been responsive to any of your entreaties to visit with her, and has she been positively responsive to your attempt to talk to her? I guess that's the question.
You're asking, was she non-responsive?
Right.
That's correct.
Okay. We were talking about mother being controlling of the situation. There was an incident at the school system where it was suggested they should have Brandon followed up with a psychologist. Were you able to read those records?
Yes, I did.
And the mother had a certain response to that. What's your reading of the school records?
Yes, it really wasn't. I think it was more than just a suggestion, Counselor. It was a pretty strong advice, almost a direction. And their records indicate that she refused, and that she also refused to speak further with the school administration about it.
Okay. And that's approximately age 12, is that right?
That was April of the year 2000. I believe that would have been age 12. Yes, sir.
You have also indicated that Miss Odell, Brandon's mother, has a tendency to externalize blame, such as condemning other people for things. Explain that, please. First person she may have blamed, psychologist at Travis County Jail.
Well, she did do that. I'm trying to recollect my basis for that observation. I can remember a number of things.
So does she seem receptive even to the idea that the medical staff at Travis County Jail is trying to assist Brandon psychiatrically?
Well, right. I'm remembering as we proceed. The evidence of projecting blame first. You know, when the school calls her in and she's going to sue them, it's pretty clear what the premise is. They're at fault. She's not. Our kid's not. So that's what I mean by externalizing blame. It's what shrinks call projection. Okay, and that is her pattern.
You've read through the offense reports in
Right.
this particular case.
I have.
And the offense reports reflect a lot of recorded telephone calls.
That's correct.
Okay. So you're seeing that same pattern in some of these recorded telephone calls from the offense report.
Right. She's going to sue Travis County. And I appreciate that. I believe she loves her son. I know Samantha does. Loves her brother. But it's just misguided. Because, yeah, there'll always be some grievances. I mean, that's part of the uniform of being incarcerated. The visitation, the mail, the TV, recreation, whatever. But, I read some stuff that really was very troubling. That, I don't know how much of it was literal or metaphorical, but that he was being abused and that she was going to sue.
Okay. So what effect does that show what sort of upbringing Brandon had in his life?
Right. That would be, I think, reflective. I think that's, I don't have any indication that that's just a recent trait. I know I have a problem when I respect law enforcement. She's referring to law enforcement, if I may quote, as dicks and fucks. I have a problem with that. I have the biggest problem when she was blaming Officer Padron.
So that's something she's doing in these jail phone calls?
That's correct. I mean, the reality, it's clearly not compatible with reality. And it's not compatible with Brandon's remorse, so I have a big problem with it.
Okay. What other areas other than the depression which you talked about of concern do you see in Brandon?
Other than depression, You know, I struggle with that, and I could have written volumes. I think I reduced it to something simple like he lacks confidence. He lacks confidence in others, and obviously that's trust. He lacks confidence in himself, which obviously is self-concept. And he lacks confidence in the world. He doesn't know what to expect. It's unpredictable. It's inconsistent. Those problems with trust go back to the earliest relationships with the primary caretaker. And it's a template. A problem with bonding is going to contaminate relationships, you know, indefinitely. And certainly we see that. You know, he's very cynical, very distrusting of anyone. Once he finds out that you care and you're not judgmental, he warms up. He has a lot more relatability than one would expect with this characterization that he's like his dad, being a loner, being quiet. He is a loner phenomenologically, he is quiet, but he's someone who reaches out. He's just fearful of rejection, and it's not that he prefers aloneness, it's just that that's the path that's left available for him.
Is there a story that's been related to you that illustrates that dynamic having to do with the what's called the rocks in the backpack incident?
That would be the type thing, counselor, that would reinforce, gosh, it'd reinforce a number of things that are not good. That incident, and I believe there was a couple of incidents around age 10, 11, maybe 12, in which Brandon was made to wear his backpack filled with weights and rocks or books, I believe day and night. To be fair to Mom, the message was, you know, so you'll know what a burden you are. Okay?
So Mom made him wear this backpack day and night.
That's correct.
Full of rocks.
That's the way it's portrayed to me.
And what was the message from her?
So he would realize what a burden he is to her.
What message did that send you?
Well, to be fair, I think this is a misguided, loving thing from Mom. I think she hoped that it would be a deterrent to his behavior because he would see, you know, make the connection that she's burdened by this. The problem is a little kid doesn't think like that, and a kid will possibly take the conclusion which Brandon took, which is there's something wrong with him, you know, that he is a burden, period. We're not focusing on the misconduct that should have been isolated. It comes down to who he is and what he is or what he is not. And that he's not lovable, that there's something wrong with him. And that's the type of, if that type of experience is reflective of his background, I mean, we know what's happened to Brandon. It's a matter of understanding what are all the determinants, what are all the influences.
Now, what do you mean? Well, the reason we're discussing this is we're discussing determinants of behavior. Is that accurate?
Well, yes.
So what do you mean by determinants of behavior?
Well, determinant, I use that word to basically mean understanding. But if we have a particular behavior we're trying to understand, we look for determinants of that.
Okay. So, Mom making him carry the rocks in the backpack, does this coincide at all with the onset of, you know, when this depression starts to manifest?
It's hard to say. I wouldn't look for one cause, one effect. You know, like I think that's too oversimplified. But there is evidence that the depression. I think Brandon said originally he was aware of depression around the time of the divorce. That's certainly not uncommon, that a kid would feel depressed when the parents split up. But very likely he had trouble before that.
Are there other symptoms like self-mutilation and that kind of thing?
He actually had, yeah, I'll mention that. Before that, kids can have what we call depressive equivalent phenomena. They don't come forward and say, I feel bad, I'm depressed, I want to see a doctor. They can act it out. They can be truant. They can be irritable. If they do verbalize something, it may be something like, I suck, life sucks, you suck, you know, and they die. So these things that we see that are depressive equivalent, irritability and truancy, it's not always depressive, but we have to look at those features in terms of whether or not it is depressive. from my perspective, if I evaluate a kid and he is depressed and I don't provide treatment, that kid may not get another opportunity. So the burden is on me to make sure that I'm really providing a service. So we always evaluate things like that. I don't know that that's depressive in this case, but those symptoms preceded the self-cutting, I believe. It's hard to know when the cutting started, and I wouldn't say that the cutting was purely depressive. Self-cutting is certainly something we see with depressive syndromes, but it can have other motives too. It can almost be a social thing. Kids get together, they're feeling alienated, they burn themselves, they cut themselves, they scratch themselves, they make agreements that they're going to die at a certain date or a certain age. So it's hard to label that strictly as depressive, but it's certainly not incompatible with the depressive pattern.
Well, you said that you've seen depression in this particular case. What exactly, how do you define that?
How do I define depression?
Sure. Yes.
Well, when doctors use the term depression, we're talking about more than just a sad mood. We're talking about an entire syndrome that involves a number of what we call neurovegetative signs. Can talk forever about it. If people have had depression, I don't need to talk any further. They know, they don't need my persuasion. It just seems that people who haven't are more likely to be judgmental, that it's not real. You just don't be so self-centered. Go whistle a tune, go do something for somebody else. That just makes genuinely depressed people worse. So the syndrome itself can involve a number of features if we're talking about real clinical depression, not just somebody having a bad day or discouraged or sad because of some loss. Reactive depression, reactive mood, that's not clinical depression. It's a disservice to prescribe for something like that. A genuine depression generally includes other neurovegetative signs. There can be a loss of pleasure, a loss of interest, seclusiveness, withdrawal, excessive self-criticism, guilt, self-reproach, low energy, trouble concentrating. When one does think, it tends to be more negative. It's negative brooding, negative ruminating. Problems with appetite and sleep. Appetite is generally diminished with depression. It can be the opposite. It can be increased. There can be sluggishness and lethargy. There can be agitation, anxiousness. Sleep is the same way. Usually diminished, can be increased. Pessimism, discouragement, hopelessness, and these can obviously progress to suicidal thoughts or even behavior. One thing to emphasize with the depressive syndromes that we see, it's not just a mood disorder, it's also a thinking disorder, counselor. People have thoughts about themselves that are changed. They're normal for depressives, they're just not normal for the rest of us.
What do you mean by that? What kind of thoughts?
Well, this is the basis of cognitive behavior therapy, is changing the thoughts of those who are depressed. I'm worthless. My life is worthless. My future is worthless. Nothing's good. So these are very real, potentially damaging thoughts, and that can be, one of the rationales for approaching depression as a treatment.
So you talked about how you believe depression exists, severe depression exists in this situation. What evidence do you have for that?
Suicide. Are you talking about in this case?
Yes.
Well, I thought you meant that depression exists. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No.
Yeah, depression is a real entity, and that would be one proof of it. What is the proof in this case?
Yes.
I'd really have to look back at my notes in terms of the findings when I saw Brandon back in October. He was struggling with, the features I've mentioned, I really don't remember which ones he had. He didn't have the full syndrome, I'm confident of that. He had enough of the features to be convincing that he had a clinical depression.
Let's take a step back. What historical evidence is there that he had depression?
Okay, well, see, that would be part of what influences me, and that kind of gets into the investigative thing. We provide evaluation, and then it's somewhat investigative when we're reconstructing someone's history. Truthfully, can't prove it, but it's all part of the picture that we see with genuine depression. We see this type of childhood behavior, the irritability and truancy and behavioral problems, bitterness.
What about early suicide attempts? Is that unusual?
Well, it moves from that into like self-injury. Not always, but it can.
Well, let's talk about Brandon's personal history.
Okay. Well, he did have the irritability, the symptoms that could be depressive equivalent. He did have the self-cutting. By age, I think it was 14 or 15, he was researching online for painless ways of suicide. I think it was at age 16 that was the carbon monoxide incident.
I mean, shut himself in the garage with car running?
Yes, sir.
And that's another suicide attempt?
Yes, sir.
Did he report another suicide attempt using a gun?
There was a serious thought at age 18 when he took his mother's gun, got a hotel room, and was contemplating. It may have been something as simple as remembering he had a test the next week or something. It can really be things like that. When someone is ambivalent and has mixed feelings about it, they want to live but don't want to live and don't know what to do, it can literally be something almost silly that can tip them one way or the other.
Are these suicidal thoughts and plans red flags having to do with depression?
Yes, certainly. That would be the confirmation of depression.
Would you say that these are manipulative behaviors, or telling you about this is somehow manipulative, or does it indicate something else?
Well, if you're asking if suicidal behavior can be manipulative, it certainly can be. We see individuals who have suicidal acts as almost an interpersonal style. Their needs are not being met, well, they're going to kill themselves. Well, they don't like how something's going, not getting enough attention, well, they're going to kill themselves. Obviously, when we see that, we try to extinguish it because it's not going to serve them well in the long run. Healthy people won't put up with that. So someone may have intended that behavior would serve them, but it's what we call maladaptive. By maladaptive, I mean it just doesn't serve. So, yes, one can be manipulative. I guess one could say Brandon was manipulative all the time, but I don't think that's compatible with the overall picture.
And with your personal history, you've certainly dealt with highly manipulative people who are manipulative all the time.
They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, one can be manipulative and depressed, but I don't see the purpose of a manipulation back then. That just doesn't. It just doesn't add up in terms of what the payoff would be. It certainly wasn't an interpersonal style with them. Heck, he didn't even tell people.
What about the medical records at jail? Did those verify your diagnosis of Brandon having major depressive disorder?
Right. I might add Dr. Tara Wagner is one of the psychiatric consultant physicians there to the jail. I saw her record. Now, I saw her record after I saw Brandon. I saw Brandon with no records and made my own diagnosis, got my own history. And then looking at the medical record, I saw Dr. Wagner's entry. She had originally, well, there's some interesting entries. I believe Brandon himself probably denied depression and probably didn't disclose any history of it. So you can say, well, that proves he's lying. Well, not necessarily. It may prove that he was not one to disclose. He was not necessarily insightful about what all that stuff was. Dr. Wagner...
Maybe he didn't have faith or confidence in the psychiatrist.
Well, that could be. It appears that he was programmed to believe that. So, Dr. Wagner originally made the diagnosis of adjustment disorder with depressed mood and prescribed medication. Now, to be really precise, that may not be the best way to proceed. When I think of an adjustment disorder, someone is depressed because of a loss or they got fired or something like that, I don't prescribe for that. So I think if one's really going to be precise, that may not have been the precise way to proceed if you're really scrutinizing records. However, she did prescribe and then later revised or amended, revised really, the diagnosis to major depressive disorder, severe and recurrent.
So originally when he came into jail, she said he's suffering because he's upset because of this incident. And then later, she changes her diagnosis to say, no, he is genuinely depressed.
Well, I think she probably saw depression, and she initially maybe put herself in that situation and thought, well, it is depressive. What's happened? What he has to assimilate. He's lost his liberties and privileges. You know, it's a depressive life circumstance. So it's not unusual. I think in that situation, I might make a diagnosis like that. But as she got more information, she appropriately modified the diagnosis.
Does that kind of diagnosis, or that kind of depression cause a person to devalue themselves and devalue life in general?
A major depression would, an adjustment disorder would not. So, you know, we really have two psychiatrists who have been involved. Both psychiatrists have independently said major depression.
Okay. Well, what causes depression? Why does a person get depression?
That's the nature-nurture debate again. One of the best ways to understand it would be, I mean, there's the biopsychosocial model in which we look at material from the biologic, that means genetic, medications can cause it, steroids can cause it, illnesses can cause it. We look at the psychologic profile, we look at the relationship. There's another model, the diathesis stress. Diathesis is basically a predisposition, and it's virtually always the genetic predisposition. I think that makes a lot of sense. People may have a genetic predisposition, and then with certain life circumstances, the depression may evolve. However, I see depression many times. There's no life circumstance. Nurture, you know, one's childhood can be fine, and people can still be vulnerable to depression if they have a strong genetic vulnerability.
And do you see that vulnerability in this particular case?
This seems to have components of a genetic vulnerability, I mean nature and nurture. There are definitely things amiss in terms of nurturing, reassurance, confidence, instilling love in himself.
So exactly the things we've already talked about. So the parents seem to have depressive presentation. The way they're raising him is the way a depressive might raise their children. So they've passed the genes on, and then they have raised him in certain ways. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and their style was to not seek help. They apparently self-medicate with drugs or alcohol, and that was passed on to Brandon. Unfortunately, Brandon probably has a stronger addictive vulnerability. He's highly addicted.
And what's your evidence of that?
Well, the history that I elicited, which is he started drinking, not for a buzz or to be with his buddies or something. He was like 9 years old. And it was to basically obliterate reality. He didn't want to mess around with any intermediate steps. He wanted to drink till he was drunk and pass out. When that didn't seem to do that much for him, he progressed. I believe the next step for him was probably cough syrup. He abused that pretty heavily. Eventually it was marijuana. I think by college, and there was some other, by 13 he discovered, I think with a peer, they discovered a computer duster. And of course that's an inhalant that's very, very disruptive to normal neurologic development. I think that was just off and on for a year or two.
I know we've heard a lot of testimony about drug use in college and until our incident. Is that something that we can characterize as self-medication? And why would a person like Brandon turn to self-medication instead of seeking professional help?
Well, again, if that was his model, not to seek help, but to just self-medicate. Psychologists can't be trusted.
And by his model, what do you mean by that?
Well, nobody else got any help, and this is what they did. They just did drugs or alcohol. And apparently that was reinforced with some very vocal condemnation of psychologists.
Okay. What parent is vocally condemning psychologists?
The same one who was always vocal, that was the mother.
Okay. doesn't trust him. What kind of things does Brandon say she should say about psychologists?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, what kind of things would mom say about psychologists?
Well, from the transcripts of conversation, or conversations at the jail, the psychologist assigned to work with Brandon was a stupid idiot bitch. She was a piece of garbage. She was paid off by APD. I mean, it's freaking crazy to talk like that. I understand being supportive and loving your son, but that doesn't serve any purpose. And I apologize for implying that that's, but it's just, it sounds like she's troubled. She's not thinking right.
What, now Brandon had this relationship with Jenna, and this major use of Xanax appears to have occurred after Jenna. Why is it that that breakup would cause such a downward spiral?
Well, right, the Xanax was after Jenna. Okay, I don't think he had even discovered that yet. The downward spiral, you can really look at that on a couple of levels. The relationship with Jenna, on its own basis, that was catastrophic. That was his one significant drug relationship in his life, other than immediate family. And they were together 3 or 4 years. And it was traumatic it was traumatic partly because he drove her away. And he knows that at some level. Very desperate for her, but not knowing what to do with it. So,
what is his does he seem to have regrets for that loss of the relationship?
he would have regrets. He would have self-blame. To me, that was an impressive thing about Brandon. When I talked to him about that, a bad person is going to blame the other person. She dumped me. What has she done for me lately? He said I was mean.
So he recognized that it was really his fault the relationship fell apart.
You know, it's never just one person's fault, but I think the majority of the responsibility lay with Brandon, and he knew it.
And he expressed that to you?
I'm sorry?
And he expressed that to you?
Yes. He told me he was mean. He drove her away.
So
when he drove her away, and she's gone, but then that's bad enough. But on a deeper level, here's someone who has this inner pain of what is his worth, what is his lovability. I really think, I can't prove this, but I think that's a panic that we all have. I mean, why is it with 7 billion people in the world, when somebody breaks up with us, it's the end of the world? There might be a few other candidates out there, but we never feel that. I can't tell you on a scientific basis what that's all about, but I've known, to my satisfaction for decades, that there's this intrapsychic crisis, this battle that we have as to what is our worth and what is our lovability.
So does Brandon at the time of the breakup have a lot of coping skills that he's developed, or is he more limited in those coping skills?
His coping skill counselor was, they were very, he had, as we would say, a very impoverished repertoire of adaptive coping. What that means is he's going to go do drugs or get drunk,
Okay.
or both.
So when he gets knocked down, that's liable to be what his response is.
I'm sorry?
So when he gets knocked down, that's liable to be what his response is.
That's correct. That's how he nurtures himself. That's how he escapes. That's how he handles his pain,
Okay.
is just to wipe it out.
Now, we're not trying to excuse his use of Xanax that wasn't prescribed to him and say that's okay because that's the only thing he knew and we should just forgive that. That's not the argument that we're making.
Counselor, I've been a counselor 45 years. I don't excuse anything. I try to understand it.
So that's your discussion today, is try to understand why Brandon got to this point where he was relying on the Xanax to ease that pain.
The Xanax was just the latest in a line of addictive agents. It was available. I'm not sure even how he discovered it, but he liked it, primarily because of its amnesic quality, probably. And it's good at that. It's a horrible drug, but if you're trying to forget, it'll dang sure do that.
Okay. How does this interact with the frontal lobe impairment that we heard testimony about from Dr. Harold?
Well, the frontal lobe impairment, Let me organize my response, Counselor.
Does that have any effect on his likelihood to abuse drugs? Does it have any effect on his responses once he's under the influence of Xanax?
Well, I think my colleague emphasized neurodevelopmental immaturity. I'm not sure the word he would use, but that is part of normal development. We think of that maturational process that's going on into the middle of the third decade, age 25 or so. And so until that maturational process is completed, one would be more vulnerable to, would be more impulse-ridden. There's a circuitry of puberty, and then there's the ample emotion, we all know. But then in terms of cognitive control, that comes later. So that would feed into, impulsivity. And the thing about Xanax is it is somewhat disinhibitory itself, probably in terms of feelings and impulses. One is going to be more impulse-ridden.
Okay. So are you saying a person that intoxicated on high levels of Xanax is liable to do crazy impulsive things they would never do in their normal life?
They would be, I wouldn't challenge that thought. That may be going a little bit too far. The word I would apply is that they are disinhibited. The normal inhibitions that are there are not in place. Now, his normal inhibitions are not, they're not already in place because of his age, and that disinhibition is compounded by a medication or a substance like Xanax.
Okay. And then you combine that with a slight or some impairment of this frontal lobe disinhibition, and those all act together, don't they?
That would compound it, yes.
Okay. So let's move back to where we started, which is your formal diagnosis. Now you sort of gave us an overview. Can you tell us more specifically about your specific diagnosis and other aspects of that? Your formal diagnoses from DSM-5.
Right, that depends on the setting. If we're in an academic setting, I'll give you a lot more. But for this setting, try to keep it simple.
Yeah.
Just major depressive disorder, recurrent, severe and recurrent. Now, there are the substance abuse issues. In DSM-4, our previous nomenclature, there was wording in terms of abuse and dependency. In DSM-5, it's been in effect since probably May or so. We speak of use disorders, and we use the term mild, moderate, or severe. So it doesn't really emphasize dependence or abuse so much. It's use disorder. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with marijuana with that.
Okay. So your first diagnosis, you said these came out of the DSM. Can you just describe quickly what the DSM is?
Okay, it's a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. That's our current official psychiatric nomenclature. Now, the number DSM-5 would be 296.23.
So the DSM is the diagnostic manual that defines all the mental disorders that are agreed on by the scientific community. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So the first diagnosis then is major depressive disorder, severe and recurrent. Now, does recurrent mean is not always there every single day? It comes and goes?
That's correct. And it could probably remit for weeks, perhaps even months. Brandon described the pattern to me as though, like if I know you can't see this, but if he had a normal level, what we call euthymia, that he can approach that normal at times and then kind of drift back down and then approach it. It's like he's always not quite there. There's always a discontent or a dysphoria, but he's not always in the depths of depression.
All right. And then your second diagnosis you were telling us is this use disorder. Is that like substance use disorder?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And so what more specifically did you say about that?
Well, the specific use disorders, first would be 304.10 anxiolytic use disorder, and that refers to the Xanax.
Okay.
Xanax is an anti-anxiety medicine, what we refer to as an anxiolytic. It's in a class called benzodiazepines. It's the same as Valium, clonazepam, Ativan. Ativan and Xanax are short-acting and potentially much more dangerous. Clonazepam, Valium are considered longer-acting, but they're all benzodiazepines. And so his use disorder of that would obviously be severe. And I said in institutional remission, that means he's not using now. Would he be using if he had the opportunity? There's no proof that he's cured of his addiction, but we're just saying he's not using because he's in institutional remission. Alcohol use disorder, 303.90, alcohol use disorder severe, also in institutional remission. I put in an other, 304.90, other or unknown substance use disorder. He's done a number of things. Gosh, as a kid, Dramamine, Quercetin, whatever combinations they throw together. So I said this is moderate. He's used cannabis. He's used cocaine. Those are, in institutional remission. What I was going to say, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with cannabis, if that's going to be a use disorder, if it's going to be legal. I'm not sure what Shrinkdom is going to do about that ordeal, but that's not for us to struggle with.
And these numbers, doctor, that you're listing before your diagnosis, do they refer to sections of that DSM manual?
That's correct.
You said also that he is avoidant, I think is another diagnosis.
Right. I don't think there would be any disagreement if you had many clinicians in here, psychiatrists, psychologists, about the first few. I would concede there could be some debate about the avoidant. I don't have any debate about it. I initially thought he might be schizoid. Schizoid means someone who doesn't really value relationships. They just seem to be by themselves. They prefer to be by themselves. An avoidant person is someone who's avoidant out of necessity. They prefer relationships, they would pursue them, but they just haven't worked out. So some of the features of avoidant that I wrote here in my notes, such individuals avoid interpersonal contact because of fears of criticism, disapproval, or rejection. They display restraint in relationships because of fear of being shamed or ridiculed. They are socially inhibited because of fears of inadequacy, and they commonly view themselves as socially inept, personally unappealing, or inferior to others. Now those descriptives are borrowed straight from the DSM, so that's not any creative writing.
But those things, in your mind, describe Brendan.
Yes, they do. He is someone, if you spend any time with him at all, you'll see that he wants to reach out. He will warm up to someone who's caring and not judgmental. It's not like he's paranoid. He just doesn't have the social skills. He doesn't have the social confidence. He, as intelligent as he's been, he just doesn't think anybody really wants anything to do with him.
So avoidant as opposed to schizoid.
Right.
Avoidant means you're afraid of rejection. Schizoid means you just don't care to have a relationship.
Right. Schizoid would be that you just don't value relationships.
So what about Brendan's prognosis? You said that he suffers from severe depression. What's his prognosis moving forward, knowing that he's going to be in a incarcerated state?
I think his prognosis is good, counselor, in that, first, he's less depressed. I don't see him as depressed, really. I don't perceive that at all, clinically, at this point.
What does that say about the treatment regimen?
Well, the tendency would be to say, reflexively, for the doctors to pound their chest and say, well, look what our medication did. I think it's more accurate to say he's improved, temporally associated with exposure to the medicine. It doesn't prove that the medicine did it. Because remember, the nature of depression, it can get better on its own, with or without a doctor, without a medication. So we have to be guardedly, optimistic that the medicine's helping. I believe the medicine probably is. I suspect Dr. Wagner believes it is. There's no proof. If you want to prove it, stop the medicine. I don't think that would serve any purpose.
So stop the medicine. If he gets depressed, you'll know the medicine is what.
Well, right. Now, sometimes we do that. Certainly, if the medicine's causing trouble, if a medicine's doing good and bad at the same time, we might have more incentive to try to get someone off it. Or if it's expensive or something, this is a generic. It's available. It's very inexpensive medicine. It's available. There's no real rationale for pushing him to be off. So, hopefully the medicine's helping, whether it's the medicine or possibly the institutional reinforcement of abstention. He's not drinking and drugging. And in that sense, he is tremendously emancipated, even though he's lost all his liberties. He's free from this harsher confinement that he's had his whole life.
Which is, what confinement?
Well, depression and drugs and alcohol.
That reminds me of one thing. There was an incident with Brandon where he was caught holding some pills in his cell.
I understand that.
Have
Yes,
you
sir.
read the records regarding that?
Yes, I have.
And do you recall what it was that he was holding?
I don't recall the specifics. My recollection is that it was 8-Benadryl, which is hydroxyzine. It's an antihistamine used primarily for sleep.
It was not his antidepressant that he was.
No, not his antidepressant. There's usually a reason for that. I'm not an investigator, so I could just speculate. You know, they want to stay up late. They don't take it. I'm not an investigator. I'm not going to comment on that.
Fair enough. So the prognosis for Brandon, do the determinants of his behavior then to you help determine his prognosis going forward?
Well, I think so. You know, I would agree with that. The primary determinant of his misconduct has been, I think, depressive and drug-related. With help with that, that certainly improves the prognosis.
What about feelings of self-worth and whatnot? Is that something that can be dealt with going forward?
I think that improves the prognosis. I think, you know, one aspect of prognosis, it might not be the most important, but I think it's very important, is remorse. I don't think he can have a good remorse, a good future and good prognosis unless he can integrate this whole tragedy in terms of his, you know, broader life experience. So I'm encouraged about his prognosis in terms of the remorse that I've seen that I didn't see initially.
Well, does everyone display remorse in the same way, person to person?
Well, no, and keep in mind he's not a demonstrative person that's going to show very much. I've seen him be tearful. I think one thing that impeded his experiencing remorse, not to make excuses, I just think it's part of the reality, is that he couldn't remember it. You know, he said it was like he had a blackout and he woke up in jail. And that's not an excuse, but I think that that's part of what contributed to diminished experiencing of remorse. I think there was a gradual realization of what he's done, what he's responsible for, and I think being subjected to Officer Padron's brother's suffering, he shared that with me, that really brought things home.
So you see some signs that he is showing remorsefulness, you're saying?
Yes, sir, I do. I believe that's sincere.
You know, Brandon's a really very sharp cookie, he's a bright guy.
Yes, sir, he is.
He's a guy who probably could mislead you and try to convince you that he's remorseful when he's really not. So how can we guard against that?
Well, if he wanted to be convincing, why not start that from the start, if that's his agenda? You know, when he's depressed, he has a non-caring attitude. He doesn't care what anybody thinks. In fact, he did stuff to provoke people to execute him.
Okay. The things he said in the police car, for instance.
I'm sorry?
The things he said in the police car when he was being transported to jail.
Well, I understand there was a letter about how he would like to kill people. I think that was pretty transparent. He didn't become any more homicidal. He was just depressed. He'd tried to kill himself, and he knew they were watching him. There was no way out. So that was his suicidal ploy.
And the response to treatment for depression, does that response happen overnight, or does it take time?
No, it's gradual. What Dr. Wagner did was start the Celexa, eventually added Remeron, or mirtazapine is a generic, 15 milligrams at night, and it's an antidepressant. It can also help sleep. And then later she doubled the dose of that to 30 milligrams. So he's on 2 antidepressants. He's better while, since she has made those refinements. Is it cause and effect? I can't say. But he is better. That's the important thing.
What else can you say about Brandon's future institutional adjustment and spending the rest of his life in prison?
Well, one thing that encouraged me about Brandon is one bright spot that he had in his life. There was really kind of a sparkle in his eye as he reflected back on his work as a teaching assistant in math at Colorado State. And I got the sense he was pretty good at that. He described, it's hard to put it in words, but his style, his technique for reaching kids, I think he was good at it. I think it was serving. I think that brought him some joy. I think he could possibly revisit that. He talked about eventually gaining trust to where he could be like a consultant to staff with any computer-related questions. It's a balance, between his own pleasure and serving. I think that would apply to all of us, even in a constructional or correctional setting. He likes to draw. He could pursue that. He likes to read. He likes to write. He mentioned some topics. One thing that was interesting, the interface between technology and ethics. I didn't think that was a burning, conscience-driven interest, but it is an intellectual interest. He has some thoughts, and I would encourage him to pursue that.
And so, in terms of his prognosis, going forward in an institutional setting, do you see that as being, as him having a positive prognosis of being able to comply with the rules in an institutional setting, and being able to advance as an individual?
So long as he has more hope, and I think, I can't prove this, but with our TYC kids, it was a feeling of self-worth that he's valued. I believe that when we help TYC kids, I think that was the main thing. And with that kind of reorientation to life, he can do well. He's bright enough. Could he go bad? Could he make a maladjustment? Conceivably, depending on the further influences. But right now, I see him going in a very favorable direction.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Your Honor, we'll pass the lead.
Let's take a 10-minute break.
Probably don't want to see your notes and stuff.
Sorry?
Probably don't want to see your notes and stuff.